Hi everyone. Hope you're all doing well. We're coming to the end of the course and you just have one final exam. Hooray! I wanted to make a short video to kind of direct you to the most relevant material from the final exam for your just for your benefit. So we looked at 3 weeks worth of material in module 4, which is a module dedicated to looking at Hinduism in a kind of post-colonial context. Week 13 was dedicated to the story of global gurus. And we looked essentially at how the traditional guru model had been kind of transformed, modernized, maybe diluted, depending on your perspective, in the North American context. So, for this set of exam questions, it's really important for you to know the differences between the guru model in the traditional Vedic context, and the ways in which the guru model is being transformed in a more modern context, right? And in the traditional context, some characteristics of the guru model are first and foremost that the guru is really considered to be an extremely special teacher, much more, special than someone like, me, who's just a regular college professor. But essentially, the guru is considered to be someone who has attained liberation. So the guru kind of teaches you, knowledge that liberates you, knowledge that transcends intellectual knowledge. And often the guru is considered to be a kind of living embodiment of, the moksha, the divine, ultimate kind of goal of Vedic ascetic culture, right? So the guru in a traditional context is really elevated from, regular human beings. And the guru disciple model is, hierarchical. The guru has this special knowledge that the student who is still kind of trapped in, rebirth, really wants to obtain. And so the way to obtain that is really through kind of devotion and surrender. And you might remember in the Upanishads, the word itself means to sit at the feet of. And whose feet are you sitting at? It's not a regular college professor, it's a spiritual guru. And that guru will have, a more personal relationship with you as a student, a direct kind of one-on-one relationship. And that guru will transmit the kind of spiritual knowledge that the student needs to become liberated. And then, ideally that student will then themselves become the guru for the next generation. And so this concept of lineage, of kind of direct lineage, guru student, is extremely kind of sacred in Vedic culture. Often, when a teacher is announced or announces themselves, they often locate the lineage that they represent. Now, when gurus come to the United States, they encounter a very different cultural context. Not just in the US, on a global level now, the guru model has changed, but our focus was, on the North American context. So we're going to look at the differences that occur. So again, really get clear on the traditional guru model and the contemporary guru model characteristics. And also, it's important to be clear the way in which academics have studied gurus in the United States. And typically we have divided them into 3 waves. The first wave of gurus came at basically the end of the 19th century. Swami Vivekananda, for example, he presented at the World Parliament of Religions. I think it was in 1893 or 1895. And we're not going to look at Swami Vivekananda on this exam because we already, engaged them in the last module. We are going to look in some detail at the gurus in the second wave. So the second wave occurs in the 1960s, particularly after the lifting of the Asian Exclusion Act in 1965. And we looked, I think, in detail at two gurus. We looked at the Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who started transcendental meditation. It was a tradition of meditation called TM for short meditation that's become very popular on a kind of global scale, but particularly in the West. One of the reasons it became super popular was because he had many famous devotees like the Beatles, which is, from Liverpool, a band close to my own heart. And one of the characteristics of the Mahesh was that he really transformed his teaching from, a more religious, kind of spiritual, kind of esoteric, hidden secret body of knowledge to a much more kind of wider, kind of scientific, backed kind of form of practice and knowledge. So there's a kind of shift from a kind of religious particularity to a more kind of general scientific secular kind of language. However, he always still did both. So that's something important to recognize, that in some cases the gurus kind of transform their general teachings for a mass audience, but they retain the more kind of religious, particular, more kind of sophisticated or more complicated teachings for, a smaller body of dedicated students. Another guru we looked at in the second wave was Muktananda, Swami Muktananda, a very controversial figure. He was the founder of Siddha Yoga. And one of the reasons he was very controversial was because he was a tantric teacher. And Tantra is a form of spirituality. It's not exclusive to Hinduism. We also talk about Buddhist Tantra, for example. We talk about Taoist Tantra. But there is, Tantra is a movement within Hinduism as well. And you want to get clear on the characteristics of Tantra. There's a question on the characteristics. There's an odd one out question on those characteristics. But Tantra is it's a heterodox tradition. It's not one of the 6 orthodox Darsana schools of philosophy. So just get really clear, like, in what ways using those two examples, in what ways has the guru model changed? And just to give you some, tips, one way is it's moved from a more hierarchical to a more democratic format. Another shift is from a private, personal relationship initiation to a much kind of larger scale public initiations. Often gurus now give, the whole community an initiation. An initiation is a kind of ritual that kind of gives you permission to do a certain practice. So that used to be done on this more like one-on-one basis, but now it's much bigger. And then other changes involve capitalism, of course, as gurus enter the spiritual marketplace of the US. So I'm not going to give you all the details, but as long as you're clear on the difference between traditional and modern gurus, and you also know what guru movements came in the 1960s, who were their teachers, who were their founders, what changes did they make. As long as you've got that clear, you'll do great on the exam. Okay, so the next week we looked at after the global gurus was revisiting the history of yoga. So this was a lot of material. One way that I kind of organized it for you was to look at yoga in the pre-modern period, the modern period, and the postmodern contemporary period. So when we look at yoga in the pre-modern period, we start with yoga that appears in the Upanishads. It's an ascetic practice that we looked at. It was developed in the Upanishads. It is first associated with a kind of monism. Brahma, Atman is Brahma, right? However, as yoga develops in the pre-modern period, it also multiplies. So one form of yoga, another form of yoga in the pre-modern period is in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which is one of the 6 orthodox schools of Indian philosophy. And in that form, yoga is articulated as having 8 limbs. And physical postures, which we probably associate now completely, when we think of yoga, we probably just think of physical postures. In the Patanjali system, it's only one of 8 limbs. So there's one massive change, right? That it goes from being in the pre-modern, just a slice, the physical postures are just one slice of yoga. Yoga's so much more than just physical postures. But in the modern period, a lot of people think yoga is only physical postures. So that's, a clear difference. Another thing to remember is with Patanjali, he is not monist. It's actually a dualistic system. So they take the system of Samkhya yoga. And remember, we looked at Samkhya in module 2. Samkhya believes that reality is in 2 parts. Consciousness, spirit, and matter. And the goal is to separate spirit's kind of consciousness is like trapped in matter. And through practices like yoga, you can free consciousness. But the point I really want to stress is that in the pre-modern period, there are different metaphysical backgrounds for the yoga schools, both monistic and dualistic. Also in the pre-modern period, we have the Bhagavad Gita, an amazing text. And the Bhagavad Gita also offers forms of yoga, not just for enunciates, but also for householders. So the main point here is that in the pre-modern period, yoga is multiple. There is not one single form of yoga. Now, when we go into the modern period, this is also the early modern period of yoga, is also yoga under colonialism. And during the period of colonialism, 2 things are important to note about yoga. One is that the colonizers, the European nation states, brought with them to India European gymnasium culture. It's kind of mix of like bodybuilding and kind of health and wellness. And that culture kind of encountered traditional, historic Indian yoga. It kind of merged and became a kind of hybrid system. And Mark Singleton traces this merging, this hybrid merging. And so the important point for the exam here is that even before yoga comes to the United States, it's already part of a kind of hybrid East-West system. It's already been westernized to some degree, right? Now, the other important point to note is that yoga is picked up as a practice for the Hindu nationalists who are fighting the colonizers. They practice yoga as a way to build up physical strength, but they also practice yoga as a spiritual practice, as a way to take pride in being Indian, because the colonizers really trying to say that the West is better than India. So they're trying to reclaim a national pride, and yoga is part of that movement. But it's complex, right? Because yoga is also becoming westernized at the same time. So reality is complex. So, we need to be sophisticated and nuanced in our understanding, right? Then we moved into yoga in the United States, and we looked at how yoga is first brought over by some amazing Indian yoga teachers who teach yoga to, primarily a white American audience. And the demographic changes, right? So historically, men have been the main practitioners of yoga. But when it comes to the US, there's always women historically who've practiced yoga, but I'm talking about main populations. The main population becomes white American women. They become like the face of yoga in America, right? And then yoga also becomes part of a much broader kind of health and wellness culture. And we looked at Andrea Jane's book, Selling Yoga, and she looks at the specific processes by which yoga is kind of transformed from a Hindu religious practice to a kind of secular, physical, spiritual, secular practice, right? And this is largely through an encounter with capitalism and kind of spiritual entrepreneurship. And there's, I think, 3 main characteristics that Jane traces. There's a slide with those 3 characteristics. You need to know that slide. Exam tip. One of them is this movement away from religious particularities. Like, you no longer have to be a vegetarian to practice yoga. You no longer have to know all the Sanskrit terms. It just becomes these kind of much more are all about the physicality of yoga, which again is quite narrow when you consider the full picture of yoga in a Hindu, the Bhagavad Gita or the Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. And then we thought together, well, is this a good thing? Is this a bad thing? Like, who thinks it's good? Who thinks it's bad? Why do they think it's good? Why do they think it's bad? And one of the questions we engaged these ethical issues through was, is yoga inherently religious? Or is yoga secular? Is yoga spiritual? Like, what is the essence of yoga? Does yoga even have an essence? And we considered some different perspectives on those questions. So we considered what some Hindus say. We looked at one Hindu community. We looked at the American Hindu Foundation, and they started the Take Back Yoga campaign. So they believe that yoga is inherently Hindu, and it has been kind of stolen by white Americans who have taken over the brand and of yoga. So they say we need to take yoga back. We need to have control over the brand of yoga, right? And they also claim that there is a kind of single lineage of yoga. That's a problem. I'll get to why it's a problem, but just mark now that that's something we want to be questioning. A second group we looked at was Christian evangelicals. And Christian evangelicals actually agree with the American Hindu Foundation. They think yoga is inherently Hindu. However, they agree, but then they go in a very different direction. So they say that means that Christians should not practice yoga. That if you're a Christian who's doing a yoga class in the YMCA, just for posture, just to keep your posture up, that's really dangerous because you're actually practicing a Hindu practice. So it's actually, would be they believe that's against your Christian faith. And some of them go as far to say it's actually demonic. So there's a bit of a range there. Now, a third perspective is Andrea Jane. So Andrea Jane agrees to some degree with the Hindu American Foundation in terms of its critiques of yoga as kind of become a very capitalistic practice, right? However, she disagrees with them that yoga is essentially Hindu. And the reason she disagrees is because she looks historically and she says, look, it's not just Hindus, i.e. Vedic renunciates that were doing yoga. There's also a Buddhist yoga tradition. There's also a Jain yoga tradition, which is entirely true. She also points out that yoga has always been multiple. So she also kind of critiques the Hindu American Foundation because she sees that they are kind of claiming this singular lineage, and she's just like, that's not true historically. So Jane is both yes and no to, critiques of yoga. She wants to critique the commodification of yoga, but she does not want to argue for a more kind of essentialist understanding of yoga. So she's a critiquing the on that she's critiquing Christian evangelicals and the Hindu American Foundation. Right, sorry, I've just got computer, one sec, issue. Okay, so the final week we looked at Hindu nationalism, and we wanted to look at Hindu nationalism because it's the most dominant force in Indian politics today, both in India and in terms of the diasporic Indian community, the American Hindu community. And it has had a big role in questions around how should we represent Hinduism. It's also been a major player in these conversations around who does yoga belong to. So not only in terms of the American or Western yoga scene, but in India itself, Hindu nationalist movement really sees yoga as a kind of Hindu national treasure. It's implemented things such as the World Yoga Day, which on one level is really cool. It's really amazing to see, all of these Hindu, people publicly practicing yoga together. On the other level, however, it's really problematic because if you don't practice yoga, and many people in India don't practice yoga, especially religious minorities who are not Hindu, they experience that as a kind of religious exclusivism. They feel oppressed and kind of discriminated against. And we looked at some other critiques of Hindu nationalism. The main critiques are that it equates India with Hinduism, and that does a kind of disservice to the religious pluralism of India. India is an incredibly rich, pluralistic religious country. There's so many religions of India, and those religions feel, many of them feel that they've been discriminated against, or they're made invisible by the equation of India with Hinduism. Another critique is that Hindu nationalism has been involved in violence, in inciting violence or leading to violence against Muslim populations. So there's a very painful history of Hindu-Muslim relations that we unpacked in that week's material. So for the exam, I want you to be clear on what are the general characteristics of Hindu nationalism. How does Hindu nationalism position itself in relationship to Hinduism? Does it talk about Hinduism as a plural tradition? Does it talk about Hinduism as a singular tradition? What are the critiques? Who has critiqued Hindu nationalism? And how does Hindu nationalism think about yoga both in the United States and also in India itself? Okay, so hopefully this video has been will be helpful to you, and I wish you really the best of luck on the exam, and I'm looking forward to reading all of your final projects. Okay, thank you.